Good afternoon. Welcome to CondoWise, put on by Aaliyah Associates Condominium Lawyers. Today we're in session number 18, talking about shared facilities. And we're in part 2, the anatomy of playing nicely in the sandbox. CondoWise is here to provide you with information, but it's not a legal opinion. So we do strongly recommend that you speak to your lawyers to really customize solutions to your condominium corporation. We appreciate all of you sharing with your colleagues and your fellow directors that CondoWise is a free learning series, and we're happy to have them, any guests on board. Next slide, please. Today, our speakers are Julia White and Ashley Winberg. Unfortunately, Shannon Penny was called away and will not be joining us today, but we wish her a speedy return, and she will be back hopefully for our next session. Next slide, please. Well, I wanted to first apologize. Did we leave you hanging last time? Because part 1 ended abruptly, and we had thought we could manage our time within a 1-hour Zoom call, and we were wrong. So what we've done is we've extended the time today. We've got about an hour and a half. We plan on going for about an hour and 15 minutes, but we are going to recap for you from where we left off and give you a short reminder about what we spoke about in part 1. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an update on the pandemic, which is what Shannon would normally do. Welcome to wave 5. The numbers are strong, but fortunately, people are doing pretty well. Earlier this month, Ontario's medical health officer announced that the province would be lifting most of the remaining COVID-19 measures, including those pertaining to masks in indoor settings and the proof of vaccination requirements. Yay, that's a relief off of our shoulders. Since March 21st, 2022, Ontario no longer requires masks to be worn in some public settings, including schools, restaurants, gyms, and stores. Masks will continue to be required on public transit and in certain health-related settings, such as hospitals and long-term care homes. The remaining COVID-19 regulations are expected to be lifted by the end of April. So what does that mean for condominium living? First of all, condominiums have the ability to decide where they are in making decisions for their community that best suits the circumstances for your community. We have communities where there are people who are elderly, and it's better to wear masks on the common elements. The new changes do not prevent individuals from wearing a mask should they wish to do so. Condominiums can still continue to pass and enforce their own rules that would require individuals to wear masks or face coverings while on the indoor common elements. The board has discretion as to whether such a rule will apply to all interior common elements or only in certain places or at certain times. Condominiums who have implemented a mask policy can choose to keep them or revoke them. In the event policies are kept, they will generally still be enforceable so long as the board has a reason to believe the policy will protect the community and help promote the safety of all persons on the property in accordance with Section 117 of the Act. In addition to the removal of masks on the common elements, most measures applicable to condominium indoor amenities, such as fitness rooms, pools, saunas, and steam rooms, have been lifted, including COVID-related capacity limits, mandatory screening, and recording a user's tracing information. But again, condominiums can make their own choices. It's important to remember that while the province still continues to remove restrictions, the virus is still within communities. And so it may be reasonable that boards in some condominium communities decide that a mask and a vaccine policy is the best course of action. Boards are likely to consider the nature of the community, including the types of building and the ages of residents. A condominium board continues to have a duty to manage, control, and administer the common elements and has a right to apply COVID measures as they see fit. But what we're recommending is you put a sunset clause in there so people know that the board is looking at them and will determine whether they are still applicable. It shows that the board is cognizant of the evolution. And as you know, we've all had to address changes. So a condominium board may wish to consider additional safety measures for indoor amenities, such as still limiting amenities to residents, having users book their spots in advance, asking people to screen if they are using the common elements. There are tools online from the government that can help people assess their symptoms and make a determination. Adding air filters and increasing cleaning and disinfecting, because we know now from the 2 years that we've all been through how the virus is transmitted. We could go to the next slide, please. So I'm just curious in the room, how many of you have been part of a shared facilities agreement? And it should say dispute at the end. Yes, you have been part of the dispute, or no, you have not been part of a dispute. And it'd be appreciated if those of you who are with us could vote. Can we close that poll? Okay, so some of you have been part of a dispute, and some of you have been fortunate not to be there. So you're hopefully going to try and avoid disputes. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Julia White, to talk a little bit about the structure of what we discussed last time, and then to catch us up on some case law that's applicable to shared facilities. Julia?
Thanks, Patricia. So in part one of this shared facilities session, we introduced a metaphor for how to look at shared agreements based on human anatomy. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of that metaphor, and then we'll get into the fun stuff. So first we talked about the bones. The bones are the skeleton or the basic makeup of the structure. In this case, the bones would be the parties and the properties that make up the shared. Next is the heart. So if the bones are the structure of the body, the heart is the core. Its job is to pump blood throughout the system to keep everything functioning. So in the case of shared agreements, this would include the shared facilities, assets, services, servicing systems, and easements, which are at the center of the agreement. So basically everything that's being shared. The arteries and the veins pump blood to the heart and keep the body and the heart working. For shared agreements, this includes the cost of maintaining, repairing, and operating the shared facilities, assets, services, and so on. The brain, this is where all the decisions are made. In this case, the brain would be the shared facilities committee, or those parties that are authorized to make decisions on behalf of the shared. And finally, the systems. So in the body, the parts of each system work together to perform important jobs. In this context, the systems are major capital repairs and replacements, shared facilities budgets, shared accounts, and shared management. Next slide, please. So in part one of this session, our time got cut a little short. So I'm going to take you through the case that we were discussing last time, SVLCC 272 versus Blue Shores Developments. So the dispute in this case related to the ownership and control of a clubhouse, which the developer had owned and operated from the outset. The 4 condos brought an application claiming breach of trust and oppression against the developer, seeking ownership of the clubhouse, a declaration that a mortgage had been registered on title to the clubhouse was void, and an accounting of all monies collected as membership fees for the clubhouse. The Superior Court dismissed the application, and the Court of Appeal affirmed that decision. So the disclosure statements that the developer gave to purchasers of the condo units confirmed that the clubhouse would be conveyed to the condos within 120 days after the date that the developer no longer owned any land within the project. An easement and cost-sharing agreement between the condos and the developer provided that as long as the developer owned and operated the clubhouse, each owner was required to pay a monthly clubhouse membership fee. So the first issue in this case was ownership and conveyance. The developer had not yet sold all of the vacant units or land within the project, which meant the conveyance obligation in the disclosure statement had not yet been triggered, and the developer continued to own and operate the clubhouse. The court said that the condos had misinterpreted their contractual obligations. The developer's obligation to convey title to the clubhouse in the future was not an executory contract that had already received consideration. So this meant the disclosure statements didn't constitute a contract between the developer and the condos didn't have an equitable interest in the clubhouse and had no rights capable of registration under the Land Titles Act. The court also said that the clubhouse had been intentionally excluded from the governing documents, and the disclosure statements expressly indicated that an interest in the clubhouse was not being conveyed with the sale of each condo unit. and was therefore not included in the common elements conveyed to purchasers with their units. So the second issue in the case was the mortgage. The developer had granted a mortgage and registered it on title to the clubhouse. The condos argued that registration was made without their approval and was therefore a violation of their vested rights in the clubhouse. The court said the developer was not a trustee of the clubhouse, it was an owner, and there was no prohibition in the disclosure statement, agreements of purchase and sale, or any other document against them obtaining and registering a mortgage against title, as long as it could still comply with the terms of conveyance in the future. Finally, the condos took the position that the developer had acted oppressively in failing to convey the clubhouse, failing to account for associated expenses, and in failing to register the clubhouse as a condo unit. They argued that they were entitled to a remedy under Section 135 of the Act. The court rejected the condo's argument since the developer's conduct had been legal, fair, and in accordance with the reasonable expectations of the purchasers based on what was presented in the disclosure statement and the governing documents. The developer had not done anything wrong and was therefore not liable for oppression. So the moral of the story here is that if you signed a bad deal, too bad. There may be recourse under Section 113 of the Act, but this must happen within 12 months of turnover. So if you're a new condo, you should look at your agreement and figure out if there are any major changes that need to be addressed. Things always look good during that honeymoon phase, but you want to make sure that you have the rights you need to address any issues in the future. In this case, the condo was not within the 12-month time frame and was therefore limited to claiming damages for breach of the terms of the agreement. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Julia. I'm just going to do a quick review, recap of some of the key concepts that we discussed during the first part of this webinar series. So the first thing to keep in mind is to exercise regularly. And what does that mean? It means if you're a party to a shared facilities agreement, make sure you understand it, actually read it. And if you do not understand it, consult your corporation solicitor. Make sure you understand where exactly the shared assets are situated and what your corporation's respective rights and obligations are with respect to those assets. And exercise means a disciplined regime. So come to the committee meetings prepared. Ensure that you meet on a regular basis. These agreements often stipulate that parties don't have to meet more than 4 times a year. But it is advised that parties meet more often than that, especially if you're dealing with a large recreational facility that has a pool, exercise room, and other assets. It's also important to take charge of your health and to be your own advocate. As I mentioned, participate in committee meetings and decision making. And it's very important that you vote and voice any objections that you may have to anything being discussed at those meetings, and ensure that those objections are noted in the meeting minutes. Because if you say down the line that, oh, we are adamantly opposed to such and such, if your opposition is not stated in the minutes, that is not going to help your position later on. If your condominium is being asked to contribute to a cost that you're not so sure about, ask for a proof of payment, ask for invoices, ask to see the quotes for the work that would have been submitted. Don't blindly hand over your money, and don't blindly agree to things. That's what people need to keep in mind. And make sure you read the minutes of the meetings that have occurred so that you can note any errors and omissions at the following meeting, because these create legacy and they're very important. The third thing, make sure you know the warning signs of disease. Unfortunately, I have a feeling many of us know what these are. It's a lack of trust. You know, how is trust earned? And if you're not in a trusting relationship, that's an issue. Are you running a deficit? That's another issue. And why is that happening? Is the property and are the assets being adequately maintained? That's something to watch out for. And ensure that there's active participation in decision-making in the meetings. If there isn't, there's an imbalance there. And if something just appears to be unfair, that's another glaring sign. And I would say the biggest is if there's no budgeting or planning for major capital expenditures or repairs. And that's probably the biggest, because that's when we see the relationship deteriorate, when parties have not budgeted, all of a sudden something is broken down, they don't have the money, nobody wants to pay for it, and they're at a standstill. Also, know when to see a professional. And this is prior to the breakdown. It's a good time to ask your corporation solicitor to review the relevant agreement or agreements. You know, if you're new to the committee, if it's a new board, if there's a new property manager, whenever there's something new happening, or whenever you have a question about something, or whenever you see one of those glaring warning signs of disease. And don't be afraid of treatment. Parties should not be afraid to invoke the ADR provisions in their agreements. All working relationships have disputes, but good working relationships address those disputes in a proactive manner at the onset, so that they don't, turn into these long, costly disputes that break down the relationship over time. And remember that there are promising cures, which we'll be discussing in the next section. Negotiating a new agreement with the assistance of counsel is often a great alternative, because it can help customize the terms and provisions in the agreement so that the parties have cost-effective solutions in the event that there are standstills in the future, and to also reflect how they want to arrange their relationship and accurately reflect the nature of their assets, because these agreements are often drafted by the developers. They're sort of a standard template, and after turnover, the developer walks away. I'm now going to turn it over to Patricia. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess it's me a little bit. The doctor's in, sorry, my apologies. So now in this next session, we're going to go through a couple different scenarios, I believe 4, where we're going to be asking some questions. And these are all based upon real situations that we've dealt with our clients in the past. And the example condominium names are referencing are made up. And these condominiums have nothing to do with these scenarios we're addressing. Now I'll turn it over to Patricia.
Thanks very much, Ashley. So next slide, please. So you're suffering from sand irritation and being beaten up in the sandbox. So we've used 2 metaphors here, because we look at shared facilities as being multiple parties, condos most often, with other parties. These days, they're commercial entities or other residential condos being put in a sandbox. And who writes the sandbox? The declarant often sets up this agreement. And in the course of being in that sandbox, your body does take a beating. And the question is, how do you respond? What are the solutions? How can you fix things? So if we could go to the first scenario, please. So we have the notorious unfair agreement. Next slide, please. GSCC 10 was registered less than 12 months ago. After GSCC 10 was registered, a shared facilities agreement between the declarant as the owner of the adjacent apartment building and GSCC 10 was entered into on behalf of GSCC by the declarant controlled board. The declarant is the owner of the adjacent apartment building, and the apartment contains recreation facilities which are to be shared by the apartment and GSCC 10. The SFA was disclosed to potential purchasers of units at GSCC 10. Next slide, please. The SFA provides that the declarant shall repair, maintain, operate, and manage the recreational facilities. The costs incurred by the declarant in repairing, maintaining, operating, and managing the recreational facilities, the shared costs, shall be shared by the parties in accordance with a 50-50 split. Those are the proportions that have been determined. GSCC 10 is required to pay the declarant a monthly fee in the amount of $2,000, which shall be paid by GSCC 10 to the declarant in addition to its proportionate share of the cost. Next slide, please. Is this fair? If not, what makes it unfair? Is the SFA oppressive? If so, what makes it oppressive? What could GSCC 10 do to rectify the unfairness? And what is the likelihood of successfully rectifying the unfairness? Well, when we look at fairness, And the question is, does fairness also override what is in the contract? We know that declarants write these agreements. And the question is, do they actually reflect what we're being sold? And in Julia's case, we talked about the disclosure agreement being critical in the Blue Shores case. Blue Shores purchasers knew about the arrangement, and that set the level of expectation. So to me, it's important to understand that fairness and the contract don't always meet. And that's what happened in Blue Shores. In terms of oppression, oppression is an event where a party is unfairly prejudiced. And we have 135, but we also have 113 that talks about this prejudice. And the courts have also said that if you didn't know what the consequence could be of this agreement, it could be unfairly prejudicial. The key is, what did you know? This is where new boards really need to take the time to understand the shared facilities agreement against the disclosure agreement and take advantage of the opportunity presented under 113. 113 is your only really crucial, important step that has to be analyzed. And it should be analyzed by counsel, because I think it's completely inappropriate to say every shared facilities agreement is oppressive, because they're not. And this is where the connection comes back to the Blue Shores case. Remember, and in 113, there is flexibility in the type of remedy that's available. Many shared facilities agreements are drafted well and are modernized to today's standards. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to improve your shared relationships. However, there are definitely agreements, and you'll see more and more, where there are commercial benefits attributed to certain parties who get the tax write-offs, who get the HST input credits. And remember, because of our tax status as condominiums, we don't get the benefits of these. And so our percentages should reflect the fact that other people are getting a benefit. And this is where disclosure doesn't go far enough. And the question is, will consumers ask themselves the right question? This is, to me, where the legislature really needs to get cognizant about the regulations that they're going to be bringing in on shared facilities, because we know that they've been drafted, but we haven't seen them yet. So is it fair? Is it right that you pay for all of this? Is it right that you pay for the pool? Well, it would be, and the recreational facilities, if that's what you were told you were going to be paid. The $2,000 stipend, because there's no basis in shared facilities costs there, is just a payment to the declarant. But if it was in the agreements and you knew about it, and it was in the first year budget that was presented by the declarant, it's going to be very hard for you to challenge that later. So there are many ways to look at sophisticated condominium living these days, and the boards need to be aware of the costs that come with it. Because remember, affordability is something that we are all concerned with working in the condominium industry. We know it's turnkey living. We know that amenities are important, but how do we approach this, and what is fair? We also have clients that are now becoming aware of charging station agreements with third parties. And it's important, for example, to understand where everything fits in the grand scheme of obligation. So can we rectify this one? It really depends on disclosure and the opinion from counsel on this one. Can we go to the next scenario, please? And I think that's you, Julia.
That is me. So appointment 2, change in assets and change in service. Next slide, please. So just to go over some of the history between the parties, there's an existing shared facilities agreement between SCC1 and SCC2. The shared facilities consist of a pool, change rooms, an exercise room, and underground utilities. The shared facilities were constructed in 1990, and since then, no major repairs or replacements have been done. The parties are managed by 2 different property management companies. SCC2 has proposed that the corps close the pool for good and turn it into a green space, and SCC1 is open to that proposal. Next slide, please. So just a little more background and insight on the relationship between the two parties. So SCC1, the residents use the shared facilities often. They have money. They want to spend the money to update the shared facilities and think that the pool requires updating. And they think that SCC2 is uncooperative and cheap. SCC2, the residents do not use the shared facilities very often. They have money. They would prefer to spend their money on their own building as opposed to shared. They think the pool is an unnecessary money pit, and they feel bullied by SCC1. Next slide, please. So the questions that we want to consider are, number one, what should the corps do? Number two, are the corps authorized to do what SCC2 has proposed without notifying the owners or obtaining owner approval? And three, how can the corps achieve what SCC2 has proposed? Next slide, please. So the first thing to note is that no repair or replacement work has been done since 1990. So that means there's probably, or there should be, a healthy amount of money in the reserve fund to either carry out some repair work or redevelop that area into a green space. Next, the corps would need to figure out if the change is even possible or feasible before deciding whether or not they actually want to proceed. So the first step would be determining who owns the pool. It's always good to know who owns the assets that you're dealing with. It might be a good idea to bring in an engineer or have someone look at the space to confirm if that change can actually be made. Next step would be to check your shared facilities agreement to see what the requirements are regarding additions, alterations, or improvements, or changes in service offered by the corps that are part of the shared facilities. The SFA might mention receiving written consent from the other corp, and then there's compliance with Section 97 of the Act. So changes made by a corporation are dealt with under Section 97. In this case, it would be the two corps making a change to the assets as well as the services provided to the owners. Under Section 97, there are different categories of changes that are described in terms of cost, and in some cases, unit owner notice or approval is required. So the corp can't just take away assets or services as it pleases. There's a specific process to be followed under the Act. So under Section 97.3 of the Act, if the proposed change is estimated to cost each corp more than 1%, but less than 10% of their budgeted common expenses for the year, each corp would have to comply with the procedure under this subsection, which would require that notice be sent to the owners that describes the change, contains a statement of the estimated cost of the change, and details the rights of the owners to requisition a meeting. Once that notice is sent, the corps would only be able to proceed with the change if no requisition meeting is called by the owners of either corp, or if a meeting is called, the owners of a majority vote in favor of the change at that meeting. Then there's subsection 97.6 of the Act, which is for substantial changes. So if the change is either treated by the corp as a substantial change, which it can elect to do, or is estimated to cost each corporation 10% or more of their annual budgeted common expenses for the year, the change would be considered substantial, and the corps would have to comply with the requirements under subsection 97.4. So this means that the corps would only be able to make the change if it's approved by the owners who own at least 2/3 of the units at each corp. There's also a case, McDonough versus YCC 41, that talks about a corporation wanting to close a swimming pool because of increasing repair and maintenance costs. The court found that the swimming pool was an important amenity for those living at the condo, and that its closure would affect the market value of the unit. So the court held that the closure of the swimming pool should be treated as a substantial change, so that's section 97.6 of the Act, and the owners had to vote in favor of closing the pool in order for the court to actually proceed with that change. In this case, the cost alone would likely warrant the change being substantial, but just something to keep in mind. Once the owners have approved the change, either in compliance with 97.3 or 97.6, the parties will need to amend their shared facilities agreement to reflect that change. So that would mean removing the pool from the assets and other shared areas from the shared facilities, and adjusting that cost sharing relationship under the agreement. Next slide. I think, Ashley, you're going to be doing scenario 3, or appointment 3.
Yes. Unable to approve a shared budget, scenario number 3, and this is one that often comes up far too often. Next slide, please. Okay. In this scenario, the shared agreement provides that the committee, the shared agreement, has to unanimously agree upon a shared budget. And for the last 5 years, these pretend condos have been unable to agree upon unanimously on a shared budget. So consequently, for the last 5 years, the condos have been operating the quote unquote shared facilities. I mean, they're operating them, but nothing's really happening. And as a result of the lack of a shared budget, assets are probably deteriorating, as is the property. And so these two condos have decided to retain legal counsel separately for the purposes of negotiating and drafting a new agreement that is intended to address this budget standstill and prevent same from occurring in the future. Next slide, please. So what provisions could be included in a shared agreement to prevent this budget standstill and to prevent same from happening in the future? Next slide, please. Well, before getting to that, I just want to say that the parties shouldn't have waited 5 years before reaching out to council. They really should have reached out to council that first year when they weren't able to agree upon a budget. Condos are often hesitant to reach out to lawyers because they're concerned that's going to escalate the dispute and be costly. However, it doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be polarizing. Lawyers are actually nice people, and we get along with many of the other firms specializing in condominium law in the industry, and we work together all the time to collaboratively put together solutions for our clients so that they can move forward together. But in this instance, the condos did wait 5 years. So what could be included in a new shared agreement? A couple different things. First, the shared agreement could actually provide that if a shared budget is not unanimously approved in any specific fiscal year by a set date, that the committee shall be deemed to have approved a shared budget, in that the deemed budget would be the shared budget for the immediately preceding fiscal year, with then just increases in the quantum for each budgeted line item to reflect inflation. However, when it comes to utilities or insurance, costs that cannot be set by the condominiums, the cost would actually have to be whatever the corporations were charged. Another alternative would be to include the budgeted line items and the set budgeted amount for each line item in a schedule to the new shared agreement. And then for each fiscal year, the shared budget would include only those line items, with the budgeted line item, again, only increasing by an amount equivalent to inflation for the prior fiscal year. And then the agreement could also contain a provision that changes can be made to the quantum, either the amounts or budgeted line items can be removed or deleted by the parties if they unanimously agree in writing at a shared meeting of the boards with council present. So those are two different alternatives, but hopefully next time these condos will reach out to their professionals sooner. I'll turn it over to Julia now.
Thanks, Ashley. So appointment 4 is shared accounts. Next slide, please. So in this case, the existing shared facilities agreement does not require the corporations to have a shared reserve fund bank account in the names of both the corporations together. SCC1 wants the existing SFA to be amended so that it includes the requirement that the corporations open and maintain a shared reserve fund bank account. Next slide, please. So why does SCC1 want a shared bank account? Most likely, they want to ensure that there's money being saved in accordance with the reserve fund study to cover capital expenditures for the shared facilities. Perhaps there have also been issues in the past with SCC2 not providing their share of the costs, and then SCC1 having to cover those costs up front. So why is SCC2 opposed to the creation of a shared bank account? It could be because the corporations don't have a good relationship. They're not trusting of one another, which means they don't want their money accessible to the other corporation, and they want to manage it themselves. So what should the corporations do? Next slide, please. So the parties could look for an alternate solution. For example, two separate reserve fund bank accounts. So each party contributes separately. Each party would then provide proof to the other party that they've deposited their proportionate share into that shared reserve fund account. The important piece would be establishing a mechanism for showing proof that each party is actually contributing according to the reserve fund study. If the parties can't reach an agreement and the current arrangement is not working, SCC1 could proceed under the ADR provisions under their agreement to seek resolution through a more formal process where negotiations would be facilitated by a mediator or an arbitrator. Next slide, please. Ashley, I think it's back to you for our last scenario.
It is. All right. Next scenario is insurance. If you could just turn to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in this scenario, the shared agreement provides that the committee shall obtain insurance for property and general liability insurance in the name of the committee with respect to the shared facilities, and shall also obtain directors and officers liability insurance. And this committee consists of a couple members from SCC1's board, one member of SCC2's board, and a unit owner who was appointed by the board and is a volunteer, but not a member of SCC2's board. Next slide, please. So the questions are, should the property and general liability insurance actually be obtained in the name of the committee as set out in the agreement? No, the committee is not a legal entity. We have seen some agreements where each individual condominium corporation is a shareholder of an actual separate corporation. However, that's very rare. Usually the shared committees, it's just a group. It's not a legal entity. So the insurance has to be obtained in the name of the corporations, condominium corporations, and that would be jointly. Now, should the committee obtain directors and officers liability insurance as set out in the agreement? Again, no, because the committee is not a legal entity. Each corporation would have already obtained directors and officers liability insurance for their own individual board members. So the individual board members who have been appointed to the committee would be covered by their individual corporations, directors and officers liability insurance coverage. Now, when it comes to the individual appointed to the committee who is not a board member of either corporation, that the corporation who appointed that member can obtain, volunteer coverage, volunteer insurance for that individual, because that individual would not be covered by directors and officers liability insurance. And I think for the first, we rarely get an opportunity to have questions, but we have 10 minutes. We have almost 20 minutes for questions or more. So please feel free to raise your hand or submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A.
So we have 3 in the Q&A.
Oh,
and
perfect.
So
okay.
we'll start with one. What obligation does the corporation have to provide financial statements for a clubhouse to all shareholders, including unit owners? Interesting question. Ash, did you want to start with that?
Well, you say shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
So if the clubhouse was a registered, like a separate legal entity, a registered corporation, and each corporation was a shareholder, in terms of unit owners, financial statements, I would say that unit owners, okay, let's just say that the clubhouse is just a shared asset. So it's just a regular recreational facility. It's not a separate legal entity, and whoever's running it is the committee. Unit owners would be entitled to see the financial statements in the same way that they are entitled to see their own corporation's financial statements by submitting a records request.
And I think it's also how the assets are held, because generally, let's start with the basics in the sense that audits are for the benefits of all unit owners. If the corporation has a beneficial interest or a real interest in any of the property, either through shares or through actually owning the clubhouse, then the auditor for the condo would definitely have to account for those assets and understand what those assets are, either within the audited financials for the corp, but generally a separate set of audited financials are done for shared assets. So that's what you should be looking for, is just a separate set of statements, which then can be incorporated back into the condo's actual audited financials, because it will be important to understand even for the funding of assets and the budget requirements for the upcoming year. There's another question. Should the clubhouse budget be sent to the owners of all corporations? That's an interesting question too. So this is almost like a shared facilities budget being shared with everybody. What do you think, Julia or Ashley?
My answer would be the same as the latter. I would treat it, if it's just a shared committee, I would treat it like a budget set by the corporation, provided that, both parties agree.
Yeah, I think the thing is budgets can be shared because you need to base your common expense collections on the budget. So there's nothing really that's hidden. And it's also good to keep owners informed, especially as your shared facilities age. People want to know what the money will be spent for and how it will be spent. And you also, as the committee or as a board, want to make sure you're avoiding any unknown expenditures. So even the budgeting process and what you go through should be articulated in the agreement. So here's another question. How often should shared facilities meetings be called? We are requesting for a meeting which seems to be ignored. What is our recourse? The management company is the same management company as the other corporation whom we feel are biased. What should we do about this? Great question, May.
We get this all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. How often should shared meetings be called? It depends on the type of assets. If it's just a roadway, perhaps, quarterly would be sufficient. But if you're talking about a recreational facility with a pool, or there's a lot of walkways in the property or a tennis court, I would say at least 6 months a year, at least 6 times a year, my apologies. And so you're requesting a meeting and it's being ignored. I would suggest that you reach out to your legal counsel to send a letter to the other corporation's lawyer, or to the other corporation if they're not aware who the other corporation's lawyer is. And your comment about the management company being the same as the other corporation and that your corporation feels there's bias. We also hear this all the time. What you should do about that, some corporations, sometimes we've recommended that either, there's a couple different alternatives. If the parties are willing to come together and amend an agreement or amend a portion of it, perhaps they could say, okay, the managers will work together, or the managers will alternate every 1 or 2 years, or we'll have an independent manager entirely, or we'll have a management company that represents all 3 or the 2 corporations and the shared committee. There's a lot of different alternatives. And then Julia, do you want to answer Michael's question? If part of the SFA has to be renegotiated, does the entire SFA have to be renegotiated?
The answer would be no. You can amend parts of it. I think the easiest way to do that would be just to create an amending agreement, and it would just specify, which parts of the agreement have been either deleted and replaced or otherwise amended.
Yeah, and I think we need to really think about, aging shared facilities agreements and if they're actually working. We know of shared facilities agreements that are not being adhered to actually in the strictest terms. And we also know of shared facilities agreements that are inadequate completely in the quality of their drafting. Things have evolved and technologies have evolved. And we are really seeing clients wanting to move towards the more modernized agreement so that there's more accuracy. It's like, once upon a time, we would all pay one hydro bill under our common expenses. And that would mean we're subsidizing our neighbors who keep the windows open in the middle of winter. But now with the advent of submetering, we can actually measure consumption and pay our electricity bills directly. So there are ways for us to become more efficient and more succinct in our relationships. But something else that we've been seeing is the need for corporate governance. Why? Because people don't stay on boards forever, or nor should they do that. It takes up a lot of time. Same with shared facilities committees. So how do you pass on the legacy to make sure that the next committee members, the next directors understand what's going on? If there's a very systematic way of dealing with things, such as alternating the property manager for the shared facilities every 2 years or whatever the cycle is, other committee members can look to that sort of imposed discipline and practice and routine to set the expectations. As well, some of these facilities are really now 30 or 40 years old, some of them. And the question is, how do you undertake these major projects? Because remember, the committee for shared facility is not a legal entity. The money, we talked about separate bank accounts. We've talked about who is holding the money, who has to contribute. The money should be driven by a reserve fund study or a plan. And the question is, how does it get approved? And does it need approval for certain expenditures? And how do you go back to the corporation? So there are things to think about as you actively manage it. Ashley, Julia, from your experience in drafting these agreements, what have you seen as some of the bigger problems that you're encountering?
I'm seeing that sometimes, the agreements as they are prepared by the developers are not specific. So sometimes as the relationship evolves, the assets evolve, there are certain things that potentially fall within the definition of shared facilities or shared assets that are really not being shared by the two parties, and that one party is solely benefiting from that. So, making an amendment or carving out, these are the exclusive services or exclusive assets that only one corporation is required to pay or contribute towards is important, because if that doesn't happen, that's how the lack of trust happens over time, and the agreement would be unfair. So that's something I see a lot. And the manager thing is huge. Somebody saying that, the shared manager represents one corporation, not ours. They're advancing the other corporation's agenda at our expense. That comes up all the time.
Julia, what are your thoughts? What have you seen from some of the shared facilities that you've negotiated?
Some of the agreements are very, they don't have a lot of detail when it comes to corporate governance. So things such as when meetings are supposed to be held, how budgets are supposed to be set, just basic things that either the shared committee or just members of the board are supposed to be doing on either a day-to-day basis or just, month to month. There's no specificity. So if one party is not, coming to the table and doing something as planned, it's hard to go after them and say, okay, this is what we're supposed to be doing. There's no benchmark, there's no detail. So I think the more details that the agreement can have in terms of what's expected of the parties, the better.
Yeah. And I believe we have a raised hand. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I do see a raised hand. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could be unmuted, I think, Justine, if you wouldn't mind unmuting.
I can do that.
Marina. We'll get to you in a minute, Marina. Go ahead, Marina.
Hi. Sorry, I cannot type the question. I'm kind of driving on the road. My name is Marina. Yes, we do have a shared facility between the condominium and the freehold townhouses. That's a weird situation, and there is a road laneway. So from the perspective of the freehold homes, if they're not regulated by Condominium Act, right? So in case if they're not happy or if they do not agree to their budget or to any rulings by the committee, they cannot even, they won't be able to ask for for a meeting. I mean, to requisition a meeting, like how the dispute will be resolved.
Great question. So these are actual, so it's not another condo, it's actual individual homes that
Not a
all
vacant or
contribute to the roadway.
Yeah, we do have a shared underground garage part, which is with the sprinkle system, with mechanical portion, electrical. Yeah, it's weird.
it's not a common
Yeah.
element condo or anything. It's just
So
separate.
one is condo, yeah. So condo is sharing it with the townhouses. This is the way they were constructed and built originally.
Well, you're right, but you know, because it's a shared concept with a condominium under the Condominium Act, and without looking at the documents, I'm going to just make some loose kind of clarifications. I think that either side, anybody that's a party to that agreement, could use the remedies under the Act. And every shared facilities agreement is deemed to have a mediation and arbitration clause. So you do have the ability to tap into remedies to resolve problems. And that is something that, you know, even with inadequate drafting, you can always rely on that as a backup. Because what you would do is if there's a problem, it should be in good faith brought to the committee, discussed at a meeting, it should be minuted. And if somebody is still not happy, they should have the ability to issue a notice of mediation. And what that will mean is that both of the parties will have to sit down with a third-party facilitator to discuss the issue and resolve the problem. And if they cannot do so, and the mediation is deemed to fail, they would go into arbitration. And the arbitrator sits like a judge and therefore can resolve the dispute, but it's not in the public domain. It's in more of a privately held court. But the expectations and submissions are pretty similar to what we would do for a court matter. Julia, any further thoughts on that? Thanks, Marina. That was a great question.
Thank you.
I see another. Yeah, I see another question. One of the upcoming amendments not yet proclaimed, from what I understand, is to mandate shared facilities agreements. Would it be wise for corporation to set these up for the requirement is in place? Yes, I would think so. It's going to be really hard for that regulation to sit on top of existing agreements. You know, and it's better that the agreement is also really thorough, because my expectation of those regs is that they're just going to set benchmarks, but they're not going to have the specificity we need. They're going to be more about the topics that should be covered in an agreement. What do you think, Ash? Where do you think that reg is going to land?
I think it's going to be the absolute bare minimum, and it's just basically going to hopefully stop developers from drafting developer favorite agreements that sometimes people don't challenge in time. I don't think it's going to have enough specificity at all. So I think, yes, corporations should definitely set those up now, because we have no idea when those are going to be proclaimed.
Yeah, that's what we've got no idea when those are going to come into play. Julia, there's a question here from Donna. Part of our shared facilities managerial contract is to conduct monthly property inspections. This isn't happening. There are health and safety issues that need addressing. We have addressed this in several emails and haven't gotten a response. How can we get shared facilities management company to comply? What do you think, Julia?
Well, I think Ashley already kind of touched upon it. I mean, the first step, I think, would be to talk to your legal counsel and see if a letter can be sent. Usually a letter coming from our office or your solicitor's office carries a significant amount of weight, and at least shows that, you know, you're serious about this issue and about taking next steps. And then depending on what the ADR provisions say in your agreement, or sorry, manager, yeah. So I would look at what options are available to you under the agreement itself, whether it be regarding default or, you know, mediation, arbitration.
I also think that you could also have a position for breach under the management agreement. I think that's another place that you should go to in terms of looking at the contract, quoting the section and saying, you need to do this. And then, you know, if push comes to shove, and you're not getting satisfactory managerial services, I wouldn't pay their bills. And I think that should be a decision of both of the shared committees. Now, if it's a condominium where there's a bias, let's say there's 2 or 3 parties, but one of the condominiums is actually managed by the same management company, they wouldn't be entitled to vote on this, in my opinion. They should be recused from voting, and the rest of the parties to the agreement should be voting on not paying the manager. Management, should be executing their for their duties. And I have condos now that are in shared agreements that are doing performance reviews, and they do a really thorough set of expectations that are to be met by the manager pursuant to the contract. And they hand those to the manager. They hold a meeting and they agree or disagree and find some variation and rate them. And then what that does is put them on notice under their contract of what the failings are, and that they give them a time frame within which to get this back on track, or they start looking for a new manager. And, I think that sometimes unfortunately, the wall you have to push people to in order to affect a response or get a better management team in place.
And just a comment about shared management contracts, it's very important to have your corporation solicitor look at it. Oftentimes, they're just the ones I've seen, they're just a duplication of a regular management contract. And it's important to put provisions in there to ensure that they are acting in the best interests of both corporations, and certain protocols and safeguards the manager has to follow to ensure that that occurs.
Donna added another comment to Pat. Unfortunately, automatic managerial payment was set up. Ooh, okay. That sounds like that though comes from a shared bank account. And I would still do the performance review. I would still hold the meeting. I would still ask them to be accountable. And I wouldn't leave it at the management level on the on-site. I would go to the head of the company and say, this is where your company is not completing this work. I would escalate it up the chain. And then I would also talk to figure out how to cancel the PAP. And just say, we're not paying this amount. We're not contributing to shared facilities till this is rectified. Because if there are tripping hazards, safety issues, you also have to put them on notice of that and tell them that they are going to be held liable and accountable for failing to bring them to the committee's attention. And the committee will look to their insurance to respond, and ask them for a copy of their insurance and make sure you're noted as an additional insured. Because if there is a slip and fall, and these days we're seeing a lot of slip and fall cases, it is going to be the manager failing to meet their requirements that should be taking the responsibility. So I think we've almost come to the end of our hour. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your questions and your time. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to summarize some of the upcoming CCI events. There's the Eastern Ontario chapter that's holding a lunch and learn on budget bites. Golden Horseshoe, inflation and management challenges. Golden Horseshoe is doing an enhanced director's virtual course, level 200. Golden Horseshoe is also doing a manager as advocates seminar. Huronia is hosting an intensive director's course. London and the surrounding London area chapter is going to be having a seminar on an insurance claim workout. So that sounds interesting. And Eastern Ontario is also going to be hosting Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls or Windows. Now I am intrigued completely by that. As well, some of you may know that ACMO CCI Toronto's conference is going to be back this year in person. And we're looking forward to seeing a lot of you back there. As you know, we've taken a break. Everybody has for about 2 years, but it'll be good to see you all there and to catch up with your stories. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining Julia, Ashley, I, and Justine for CondoWise. Take care and stay well.